Hello, and welcome to my professional literacy assessment report. Today I'm going to be talking about a student named Alvin, with whom I conducted a series of literacy assessment tests over the past few weeks. A little bit of background on Alvin. He is 6 years old. He is a first grader in Lake Oswego at River Grove Elementary, where I teach as a journalism instructor 1 day a week. I specifically work with the fifth grade classes, but the reading specialist at the school connected me with Alvin. He's the youngest of two children. His sister is also in attendance at River Grove in fifth grade in one of my classes. He is in a reading group right now, but advancing quickly. One thing I wanted to note that the reading specialist briefed me on before I met with Alvin was that he is in a reading group because he performed poorly on his DIBELS assessment at the beginning of the year, which he thinks is due to him having missed a lot of school in kindergarten due to some family vacations. The last thing I wanted to note before we move on as a little bit of background on Alvin was that we met on the day after Halloween for the first time, and he told me that he had dressed up as a character from the movie Spaceballs, which I found funny but also interesting because throughout our assessments he did display a sharp, dry sense of humor that is kind of uncharacteristic of 6-year-olds. Anyways, let's move on to the assessments. So collectively, I used 3 assessments. Those include the Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills, DIBELS, the Texas Primary Reading Inventory, the TPRI for short, and the Elementary Reading Attitude Survey. Collectively, these tests are supposed to tell teachers where a student is doing well or where they're struggling and how they've progressed throughout the school year. This final survey, the Elementary Reading Attitude Survey, is supposed to indicate a student's attitude towards reading, both recreationally and academically. I'll go into the subtests that you see here, the letter naming fluency, phoneme segmentation, letter sound, etc., at length later. But first, I wanted to give a brief description of the overall tests and their purpose that they serve. So DIBELS specifically is a monitoring assessment tool that's given at the beginning, middle, and end of year. The test isn't really meant to be diagnostic, but it's more of a screening and monitoring measure meant to indicate the probability of achieving early literacy goals. So for DIBELS, there's different tests or inventories that are required depending on the time of year and the grade and the student's grade. So the 3 subtests that were required for DIBELS for a first grader were letter naming fluency, phoneme segmentation, nonsense word fluency, and oral reading fluency. I realize that's 4 subtests. Each test is timed and about a minute long. For letter naming fluency, students are given a series of capital and lowercase letters that they're supposed to give the letter name for. So if the letter was S, the student would need to respond with S. This is basically to test whether or not a student has a strong comprehension of basic phonics, if they know their letters, both capital and lowercase. The phoneme segmentation test asks students to break down words into their smaller sounds. So for example, the word sock would be sock. This tests whether or not students can blend these sounds to create words. So sock would be sock. Nonsense word fluency takes this one step further and tests whether or not students can sound out words without relying on sight words or context. It can be a little strange at first, but the test helps teachers understand if a student is truly understanding how to decode and blend words without relying on words that they already know. So instead of doing a word that they've probably seen before, like said or he, you would do a word like wub, which doesn't mean anything, but a student can apply the decoding skills that they've learned in school or at home to sound out the word wub. Lastly, in the DIBELS, there's the oral reading fluency test, which requires that a student reads a short story or a passage in about a span of a minute. As the student is reading, I tally the number of words that they get correct. and then give them a raw score at the end. This is sort of kind of the panacea for reading assessment, as it tests multiple skills at once: fluency, accuracy, decoding, blending of words, etc. The TPRI is a criterion reference test designed to tell teachers what their students' needs are in reading, so that teachers can target their instructions, whether that be for phoneme segmentation, decoding skills, or oral reading. Other than the oral reading test that I mentioned, everything is untimed. It's also important to note that the test is dynamic and adaptive, meaning that it contains a variety of reading inventories that are administered differently depending on a student's progress. So if a student progresses rapidly through the first series of screening tests, then they skip a few tests and move on. If a student is struggling during the first few tests, then they take a few more to better understand where exactly they need extra attention. So is it just that first test that they were struggling on? Okay, you take a second test. If they're still struggling, that tells you something about that particular skill set, whether that be phoneme segmentation or sounding out letters, etc. So Alvin did really well in the TPRI and moved rapidly through the first series of tests. So ultimately here, as you can see, I only used the letter sound test, the word reading tests, and the oral reading passages. The letter sound is similar to the DIBELS letter naming test, but students are also asked to give the corresponding sound for a letter. So instead of seeing the letter S and saying S, you say S or S, because that's the sound that the letter S makes. Alvin did really well on this, so we moved on to word reading. Here he read a set of words. Because he got them nearly all right, we progressed really quickly to oral reading. For oral reading, he read 2 short passages. One was about baseball and the other was about a cat named Tut. Alvin could take as long as he wanted to read these passages, and while he was reading, I jotted down notes as to whether or not he was reading words correctly, and then also kept track of the amount of time that it took for him to read, which ultimately measures his ability to read fluently and accurately. So lastly, the Elementary Reading Attitude Survey is supposed to help gauge a student's perception or reading in academic and recreational settings. So if they like reading in school or for fun or for both. It has a series of happy or sad Garfield pictures that students point to after hearing questions like, how do you feel about reading a book on a rainy Saturday? Ultimately, the student's scores are given a percentile rank and can help understand in what settings a student does or does not enjoy reading. So with that, let's move on and see the results. As you can see here, for each test, I've listed the raw score, the percentile rank, and a descriptive term characterizing the raw score that the student received. So for DIBELS here, you can see that for letter naming fluency, Alvin was given a raw score of 24, which correspondingly has a 12% percentile rank, meaning that Alvin needs a little bit of help with his letter naming fluency. He needs some intensive reading mediation in this area. For phoneme segmentation, he received a 38, so he did a little bit better. He had a 34% percentile rank, which means he's established in this skill set. For nonsense word fluency, we measure 2 different things. We measure correct letter sounds and words recoded completely and correctly. So when he's reading the nonsense words, we want to know if he's getting the sound. So like if it was wub, he could do ub and then completely wub. So how many words he's getting in total, and then how many sounds in each word he's able to spell out. For oral reading fluency, we measured the number of correct words that Alvin read in the prescribed passage. And here he received a 50% ranking, which means he's at low risk. For the Texas Primary Reading Inventory, we don't have a corresponding percentile rank, but we do have kind of a developed or still developing skill set. So for letter sound association, Alvin did